So before the break, we talked about various views of history and how important history is in shaping our lives and our viewpoints. And the view that we often have in history that we follow leaders who articulate a vision for our world, of a better world and hope. But in contrast to this view that's dominated by leaders and their hopes, whether it be Hitler or Churchill, or whether it be Herod or Caesar or Jesus, there are bottom-up views of history that include the viewpoint of ordinary people. And we see that in the Gospels, where we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, and others. There are perspectives from other people. And so we can ask the question, to what extent should history reflect the views of ordinary people? So firstly, we have the great man view with a hero who may be biased. And then we have the view that includes all people, including women. And so 50% of people. And history can then be intensely personal. That is, people can write a history, and when we go to a funeral, people often go over the history of their life. If you have a school that's not just led by the great man headmaster, but it includes all the teachers participating and being involved and recognised, and instead of your class being represented by the class captain, one person, one might have an effort to recognise every student in the class. What are your thoughts on the bottom-up view of history that seeks to include the views and values of all people, as opposed to the heroic great man view of history, in which we look to one person to set the parameters and the biases that guide us? Jackson, what are your thoughts of a bottom-up view of history in which all people can contribute?
I think it has to be, personally, I think there needs to be a bit of a balance, because I think having a leader has great advantages, but I think if I suppose just having a leader helps bring everyone into line and keep everyone on the same page. But I think also having someone who's a little bit, have too much control, I suppose, over everybody, then that's where a lot of issues can arise separately as well. So yeah, that's my point of view, at least.
Last week, we remembered Jesus talking about the servant view of leadership. And also Jesus, after 3 years, goes to the cross and hands on responsibilities to Peter and John and other disciples and apostles. And so there's an example there of shared leadership. And I think there are benefits in both. Strongman leadership like Moses, and Jesus quite often as well, but also servant leadership that gives other people an opportunity. Jackson, can you think of some advantages of a servant approach to leadership that sometimes flips the classroom and gets the students to take more responsibility, parents who flip things around and give their children more responsibility? What's the advantages of a servant-like approach to leadership that encourages others to take leadership responsibility?
Yeah, so I think with that, people can develop good morals in their self. People can learn, I suppose, what responsibility looks like as an individualistic kind of from a individual point of view, and then also how they can serve others, how they can teach others, how they can teach themselves, and how they can contribute to society as a whole. So they're learning skills from a young age if they're children, and parents can help instill that as well. So, yeah.
And there's a need for balance, isn't there, whereby we do have the strong approach to leadership at times, and that can lead to a strong view of history where there are great heroes, but other times we can involve everyone. Now, history can be intensely personal. I know when I did my PhD on megachurches, there were a few heroes in Australia who've planted the largest churches in Australia, but there are also the ordinary people. And so one tries to interview both groups of people and recognises both. One also recognises that sometimes leaders are thrust into positions by the congregation and by the followers and what they expect of the leader. So the leader's not entirely shaping the future direction. The people around them and the context around them can also shape the way in which their leadership unfolds. We could look at examples such as Martin Luther in 1500 breaking away from the Catholic Church, and the Protestant Reformation flows from that. And Erik Erikson, who wrote Stages of Development, also wrote a book on young man Luther, where he reflected on the stages of development in Luther and the way this has flowed into history. Robert Clinton, in The Making of the Leader, writes about the way in which your personal history and my personal history unfolds from the challenges that we face, and we each have a history that we can tell about our lives. In fact, everyone and everything has a history, and everything we do and everything we use, every product has a history, and you could write a history of the telephone, a history of the iPad, as well as a history of each person. History can be thought of as collective memory. That is, there's individual memories, but also there are collective memories in which people get together and they tell a story, and it has a bias about it. And one example would be colonisation, the heroic travelling out to America and Australia and colonising, setting up colonies. But then there's the native people and how that unfolded as well. So there's a huge debate on what constitutes historically significant events, and even in your own life. We've thought a little bit about what are the big events in your life, the big events in Australia's life. So what do you consider to be the three most important events of the last 3,000 years? So can I get everyone to write down 3 events that were significant in the last 3,000 years? So you're not allowed to just write down your birthday, because that's not necessarily the most significant event. And the day you signed up to study with Alpha Crucis. There are other significant events in history, possibly. If we start with Gary, what are you thinking are some significant events in 3,000 years of history, Gary?
Jesus being born.
Yeah.
World War I and World War II.
Well, why World War I, and also, I guess, why World War II?
I think World War I, to me, is significant because I feel like it's very significant for Australia. We as a nation really changed because of World War I.
Yeah.
So I used to be in the army, and so these two histories I think are very important. I think learning from, especially from history that's very, I feel like, relevant to us today. World War II, it really shaped the world into what it, in kind of the camps that they're kind of in now, and started the Cold War. The creation of the atom bomb and the use of the atom bomb is one of the biggest historical things to hit our, I guess, other than Jesus, kind of hit our world.
Yeah, so well said. So we've got a series of events there. You could also add perhaps Federation. And so Federation in Australia, 1901 through to Anzac Day, 1914 to 18, when Australia becomes a nation fighting in a war as a country. And then World War II gives us the communist countries on one side, Russia and China and others, and capitalism with North America on the other, which gives us McDonald's and other important developments like that. And then, as you say, atomic energy is probably the furthest we've gone in terms of human power. And so we've discovered Pandora's box, or however you describe it. And then, Tegan, what are your thoughts on 3 big events in history?
Jesus being born. And I would say World War I and II too, but also had, since I'm from South Africa, there was also a thing called apartheid. So, yeah.
Yeah. And then, Rachel, what do you see as the big events?
I had those as well. I also started adding more when Gary was kind of talking to, give some different perspectives. So the atom bomb is one I think is big, the 2 that dropped in Japan, because it was one of the, first big displays of nuclear warfare, and the fact of like how big the tragedy was in compared to, a lot of wars. There's civilian lives lost, but it focuses a lot more on army to army combat, whereas it was the first time that like civilians got heavily involved in that they were targeted in a sense. I think another one is what happened at Pearl Harbor, Japan bombing Pearl Harbor. I think that was significant in like within the World War itself, because that really is what pushed the Allies to jump in, as in America and Australia themselves, because it was such a unexpected thing to happen. And I think my last one would be the accident at the Chernobyl power plant, because there was for so long it's safe, we've got everything under control, it's dangerous, but we're fine, we can deal with this, and that it actually blowing up in that massive accident that was still seeing the effects of radiation and stuff till this day, that it's not completely clean yet. And it was a big disaster, but I think we're learning a lot more about radiation and that kind of accident and trying to prevent it again.
Yeah, so good. Georgina, your thoughts?
I'd say Gutenberg's printing press from 1554, I think. Allowed for the Bible to be spread in text around the world, but also just the idea of books and being able to repurpose books and reprint them quickly. I'd also say maybe Copernicum's like heliocentric view of like the sun at the center of the solar system instead of the Earth, which I think was in the 1500s. I think that was a pretty major turning point in terms of thinking about how we view the whole world views ourselves in the grand scheme of things, I guess.
And certainly we can touch on that when we look at science too, our place in the world. And some have always seen our place in the world as less significant. The animals sometimes seem ferocious and powerful if you see a lion or an elephant, but the discovery that there's lots of solar systems out there brought quite a major change. During the 60s, a new generation of historical scholars have sought to redefine largely ignored people groups. And I think every group, whether it be a cricket club or a football club, can tell its own history. Every school can tell its own history. Women now can tell their histories. Any group can tell its history. Slave communities can tell their history. Labour movements, immigrants. Every small group can tell its own history. And then each one of us can write our histories, and you can sign up for these places that provide history. There are teaching and pedagogical implications. That is how we view history and bias. Do we accept the way stories are told? How do we interrogate them? How do we examine them? Because history presents challenges. That is, we can't fully reconstruct history because most of the details are lost. It's hard to remember everything from 10 years ago in your life. And if you had to collect those details together, it wouldn't be that easy because a lot of details are forgotten and pass away. Although some of the past can be remembered, and there's photographs and there's books, most of the details of the past have gone away beyond recall. Many words, thoughts, hopes, and dreams of the past have disappeared. Some objects remain. Some parchments and coins survive, and that's what historians do. They collect objects from the past. It's been a real struggle in Jerusalem to rediscover aspects of where Solomon lived and where others lived, but the archaeology, Jerusalem, Solomon Palace, but they have dug up some of where Solomon used to be in Jerusalem. So around this area here, they can dig up rooms and dig up areas where Solomon used to live near the temple there, and on the Temple Mount today there are these records. They took a year 10 class. They'd not found a lot of details about Solomon living there, but in the last 10 years there was, I think, an American school took a year 10 class over there to Jerusalem, and they were digging in this area next to the walls, and one of the students turned up a rock that had a 3,000-year-old piece of writing that had Solomon on it. So an amazing discovery. They're still searching for more details of King David. A lot of that's been lost. Hezekiah, they have parts of the wall that he built. There are still tunnels underneath Jerusalem, and you can walk through the tunnels. I dragged my wife through those, and she wasn't quite so keen, but we found the tunnels under Jerusalem. Yeah.
Didn't they discover the toilet from 2 Kings?
Yes, they did. Yeah, discovered all sorts of
The one that they turned the statue of Baal into a toilet.
Yeah, they've discovered those sorts.
I thought that was a really cool piece of history.
Yeah, and they've discovered chariot wheels, and they've discovered quite a lot in the archaeology there. So you do have those items that remain, and at some stage, if you get a chance, you can go over there to Jerusalem. One of the interesting things is that there are still rock, stone that the Romans have turned over 2,000 years ago, stones as big as a bus that have been turned over and fallen to the side of the wall. And here's a street from 2,000 years ago that's still there today. And you've still got rocks and such forth where the Romans smashed the temple up 2,000 years ago. So quite a lot of archaeology that remains over there to be explored. In Rome itself, next to the Colosseum, there is Hadrian's Arch, and then they have the goods from the temple being carted. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, and then the gold from the temple in Jerusalem helped pay people to work on the Colosseum that was completed 10 years later in 80 AD. So there's bits of history all around us. So artifacts can be helpful in recording what happened in the past, but a great deal of the past has been lost. One of the major things that people seek to do in doing history is to collect the primary sources. So these are the original resources that were found back in those times. And so these primary sources are very, very important in the study of history. And so historians spend a lot of time looking at the primary sources. So history is a recollection of events of the past and ways they've influenced us. And so there are the events that took place, but we've got to try and find evidence of these events. There's benefits in considering multiple accounts, particularly the primary sources. And every time you study more of the primary sources, then you can find out what things were like. If you're studying the New Testament, you can look at ancient Greek manuscripts from 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, and you can look at what the original Greek said. The other side of history is the telling of the story, interpretations, and historians do this as well. And this is often called secondary analysis. And then there's tertiary analysis, where all these views are gathered together. Why study history? If you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You're like a leaf that doesn't know that it's attached to the tree, the whole culture. So primary sources, these are the original documents, the letters, the records, the art, the old buildings. And when I looked at the megachurches in Australia, I went back and interviewed people from 40, 50 years ago and how churches had grown, and then from 30 years ago, and then these interviews become primary sources. And then there's secondary sources, so you look at what other people have written and published. The best are peer-reviewed academic research, and there's also textbooks and books about history. So the best resources, remember, these are made after the time, so they're looking back, and when they're peer-reviewed, you've got other scholars who've looked at these resources to check them out and to test them. So primary sources are the initial evidence of the time, and we're looking at the ancient Romans, ancient times of Jesus, and then there's secondary sources, so people who lived 100 years after Jesus wrote about Jesus, people who lived 1,000 years after Jesus, Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther, they've written about Jesus. They're secondary sources, and all of that is part of the flow of history. Think about it, if someone held a camp day and you had these photos from the camp day, any thoughts there, Georgia? What would you say is this evidence? What's it going to tell us about what happened at this camp?
We could sort of guess that it was a children's camp based on photos of the children, I guess. We could say that, they did some rope activities and some tire activities.
So you could write up a whole account of what happened based on the evidence that you have here. Other times you could have written reports, and you could write up the account. So secondary sources, so you've got the primary sources, which is what we observe. The secondary sources, the best are the peer-reviewed, where you've got scholars around you. However, all peer-reviewed sources are within a particular school. And so if most of the people in the school are atheists, for instance, you've got historical Jesus studies, and some of those groups that gather may have more less faith-filled approaches to more evangelical groups that study. So even though they could be peer-reviewed sources, they may carry biases as well. And then you've got textbooks and museums in the academic sources. And then the popular history is less reliable again. And so there are popular books and magazines, TV documentaries, and websites. Some are more trustworthy than others. As I said, peer review is so important. It's the process used by publishers and editors to look at the scholarly quality of what's being produced, and talks are given at conferences, and many people attend these. Original research is where people go back into the libraries and look up the information. I was talking to someone recently who's been working on Once a Jolly Swagman, and what's the origins of that? Was there a shearer strike? And where was Banjo Patterson gathering his information from? So that's original research, which includes primary sources and seeks to contribute new knowledge about the past. Historiography is the term that's given to the history of the historical research on the subject, and what we know about the past changes as more information comes together. And then tertiary sources is where it's all gathered together. If you go to Wikipedia, maybe okay, but we don't know the author, we don't know the background. Whereas if you go to a tertiary source where we do know the author and the references they use, then you can understand biases. And then there's dating. And so AD and BC, after Christ, before Christ, but Jesus may have been born 4 years BC. So if you call it the Common Era or before the Common Era, then that may be a better system. So historians can't observe the past because you can't go back there, but you collect information about the past and then you work with it. Father George Filofsky said, those who don't care for history can never be good Christians, because we need to be critical thinkers to understand how faith changes over time, what makes for effective Christians, particularly as they understand history. If we have an escapist otherworld spirituality and quietism, we're removed from society, then we can construct histories that aren't really true, and we don't really engage with society if we do that. A faith whose core doctrine is the Son of God coming amongst us, being involved historically in our world, encourages us that we as Christians need to be involved in our world as well. History is a messy subject and a subject that's constantly changing and being reassessed, and it makes demands on us as we think about truth claims in history and their compatibility with transitions and change, understand of ourselves, understand of our organisations. And at the bottom, religion does engage with history all the time, and they throw critical light on each other. History exposes false doctrines, and also it points to true way of understanding and believing. So the goal of the historian is to discover and understand the events of the past as they are, as accurately as they can, but we recognise that we can't be totally objective. We have to bring in our subjective understanding, and sometimes the subjective, how we feel in the first person, is very, very important as well. We need to understand that there are biases, personal bias, group prejudice, conflicting theories, and we need to look at what we favour and like, and what is going to shape us. So thinking about some of the biases, can you think, what are some of the biases that shape you and I? So what biases, and this will be important in assignment 2, shape you and your views? I guess I was raised more with the liberal, capitalistic views of economics and politics, and yet there would be others I know were raised with the more socialist conservative views as well. So they're a bias that shaped me. Another one would be my Anglican upbringing, and that shaped me to some extent. And then there would be others from Baptist and Catholic who have different views of the world. Jackson, thoughts on what biases may have shaped you?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind is definitely the way I've been raised up in church. Come from a very Pentecostal background, growing up in that. So I think that's shaped the way that perhaps I view reading the Bible, the way I see my faith with Jesus. Also, in a political sense, grown up with a more liberal point of view. Also reserved in that a little bit more than I suppose some others were not very vocal in that. So yeah, they're the things that come to mind.
Yeah, that's great. Elka, well, some biases that may have shaped you?
Yeah, I feel like trying to think of something new. Can't think of anything new. Public school background, so not really like surrounded by upper class, so don't have much of an opinion on like I don't know, like
Yeah, you're not into
my view
opera and
seems
classical. You're not into opera, classical music, a lot of those.
yeah, not really. Like I you know, have an education. But yeah, no, I think there's I mean, like, I don't know. I'm a pretty middleman kind of person. Like
Yeah.
I've got pretty tame beliefs about most things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
I
good.
hear learn from
And Rachel, biases you can think of?
Yeah, I was just thinking of a couple like different ones. I suppose my biological parents were divorced by the time I was 2. So I grew up in a broken home. So my view on marriage and love, you know, is probably very biased compared to somebody whose parents would have been together their entire life and they didn't grow up with split custody. Another one is probably just had it in my head. I self-proclaimed country bumpkin. I grew up more towards the countryside, always having acreage, always with big animals. So I guess in the sense of biases, like I have a bias. I prefer bigger dogs and big animals. I don't like small dogs. If anything, they're scarier than like an 18-hand high horse. So I think in that sense, like I've got a bias towards what animals I prefer as well as where I like to live. I don't like the city at all.
And these are all examples of the bottom-up view of history, where we tell our story rather than just tell the story of church leaders and prime ministers and the big story. So the value of the task of studying history, we're all inevitably shaped by history. And the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on history says the concept of history is fundamental to the way we understand ourselves and our lives and meaning, fundamental to the way we understand our church, our community, because we look back on the forces in the past that have shaped us as we are, the way we understand Australia, the way we understand the world, the way we understand Europe. History invokes nations of agency, that is, history may encourage us that we can all be president of the USA and all be astronauts, or our histories may indicate that we can't do those things. I was told that Australians can't become astronauts. And so in my primary and secondary school, I gave up on the dream of becoming an astronaut. And it was only when I was in my 30s or so that I discovered 2 Australians have become astronauts. So history wrongly told has shaped my opportunities to become an astronaut. The role of material circumstance. I think history tells us that where you live, what suburbs you live in, what cities you live in, can shape what unfolds. It raises the possibility that we can learn from history and suggests the possibility of a better understanding of ourselves in the present and in the future. Can I ask a question? Is the world getting better? So there have been some Christians who through history have said that if we apply ourselves in the 1800s, then we can build a better society. And one of the reasons that convicts and others were sent out to Australia, and one of the reasons why the author of Amazing Grace wrote to the chaplain Johnson as he travelled out to Australia, was to encourage him. These convicts can become better people and that Australia can become a better nation. So is the world getting better? And then Tim LaHaye wrote a book, Left Behind, in which the world is getting worse. And so God's abandoned our world to some extent, and we're awaiting Armageddon, or is it both? Is it about human nature, sometimes good, sometimes worse? Jesus preached, thy kingdom come. So did he just mean in the future, or did he mean in the book of Acts and through Christians acting in history as they build schools and universities and hospitals, that the kingdom of God can come? Or is it more complex? So is the world getting better? Is the world getting worse? Is there both? the kingdom come and more complex. Are there laws of history? And what are the laws? And does the Bible tell us about the laws in books like Judges, where if you follow the things of God, things get better, but if you neglect the things of God, they get worse, and you need a leader or judge? That seems to be the history told in the book of Judges. Rachel, what are your thoughts on whether the world's getting better or worse?
I think it's a combination of both,
Yeah,
and more complex than that. Depending, again, I know we're talking about bias, so it's going to come up, but depending on who you talk to and their bias and their worldviews, it's getting better. And then in the same sense, you talk to somebody else and they say it's getting worse. Like environmentally, we're probably not getting better. We might be at a plateau, but we're not getting better. We could be still getting worse. You know, there's just a lot that kind of goes into it, because yeah, the world may be getting better with technology, but is that always a good thing? And, you know, that brings into question people that, you know, AI and computers and that whole idea that AI is going to one day overtake us. And I just saw you put it up there. Things like in America, their amendment, I think it's the First Amendment, where they're allowed to have firearms, is like, cool, that's great and all, but that was back when they had shotguns and they had to take like 5 minutes to load this thing, rather than semi-automatic weapons that they have now. So it depends on your viewpoint, and I think it's really complex, and I don't think there's one correct answer.
Second Amendment.
yeah. Gary, what are your thoughts?
I think it's a combination of both, because you do see places in the world that are getting better, but also as places rely on science more, and actually, like, America is a great thing to watch, as that country, when it had the Bible at its center, was a powerhouse for the world, and it really changed the world, in my opinion, for the better. And as they've gone away from I think this is actually true for to the Romans as well, as they came into Christianity and then moved away from it. Those Christian influences have been very positive on those societies, but then as they've walked away, they've gone really downhill, and then either destroyed themselves or stagnated.
There's a book being written on the Bible in Australia, in which Meredith Lake talks about the positive beneficial influence of the Bible in Australia, but she also says at times the Bible can be used to oppress as well. And so I think Christian influences can be both beneficial, but they can also be negative. They can lead to the buildings of hospitals. They could also lead to crusades. Yeah. Any further thoughts on that, Gary?
There was a John Dixon did a thing a few years ago.
Yeah.
Called For the Love of God, and it was a series. I think it was a 4-part series on the history of Christianity, the good, the bad, the good and the bad. He really didn't shy away from it, and was still kind of trying to really show why we do need the Bible and whatnot. But it really does go, you know, even we make mistakes, and here are the mistakes, and we're going to acknowledge them and own them.
Yeah, so good. Georgia, your thoughts on whether the world gets worse or better?
Yeah, I think we're living in a time that in an overlap of the ages, so a time that in which the kingdom of God has come, but also that Jesus hasn't come back to fully restore all of creation yet. And so I think that we see a pattern of bad and good. I think that we have seen some really great ways that we've learnt to tell people the gospel, but I think likewise, like, it is the end times, and so we can expect that there'd be bad things that happen as well. I think, though, like, we aren't I think I would say that we are probably not better or worse, but definitely not better. Like, I think we tend to think that we're morally better than perhaps previous historical times, but I don't think that's true, because we still resort to the same sort of human nature that we have, but perhaps slightly better because of the opportunity of the Spirit and things like that. I don't know.
Jared Diamond has written a couple of books on history. One of them he called Guns, Germs and Steel, in which he said the three major things that have shaped history have been guns, germs and steel. And you mentioned how guns have changed from just a few shots to a lot of shots. He then wrote another book called Collapse, in which he looked at societies that fail or succeed. And he said, never have we had the pressures on our environment that we have now. And so the world's population in the last 150 years has risen from 1 or 2 billion to 6 or 7 or more billion, and it's still going up. So there's a lot of pressure on our society. Number of cars is huge. Pollution is huge. But Jared Diamond also says he's a bit of an optimist, in that never have we been better positioned to deal with the challenges that our world faces. Now we have the best technologies, the best science, and then when we get illness, we can use all of our technologies. And I think we could say the same as Christians. Never have we been more challenged by secularization, by other faiths and beliefs and atheists. But at the same time, never have we had resources like internet, social media, and all the resources that we have to reach out missions-wise. Can I get everyone to write down now what have been 3 things that have stood out in today's lesson? So we had our first lesson on history and what it's about, and then we've now had our second one where we're going further into history, and we've looked at biases there. So what are some things that have stood out to you as we've looked at history and how an understanding of history helps us to be more critical in our thinking, because we can understand how our history got to where we are? Gary, what stood out to you today?
I think being really aware of the bias of the person writing the histories.
Yeah.
Where it's coming from, whether it's been peer reviewed, things like that. That's the thing, and that kind of stood out to me most.
And there's a couple of Christian perspectives as well. I like Meredith Lake in that hers is a more middle position. And then you mentioned John Dixon. His is a very thoughtful middle position. But sometimes you get the less scholarly Christian positions. There's always a bit of a danger that they can be making claims that have less support. And then the same with the atheistic positions. And so you've got Richard Dawkins, and there can be claims with less support. So I think those middle positions with peer-reviewed scholarship behind them, really good and strong. Sounds good. Rachel, what are your thoughts? What stood out to you today?
I know we talk a lot about everyone having different views, but in the sense of on the opposite scale of that, today has been very much seeing everybody else, like that we all have very similar viewpoints, like, with a few differences, and I guess that's, coming from a Christian's perspective, and the fact that we are Christians, that we're like, have that very similar viewpoints of right and wrong. And sorry, I'm just trying to get to my Word document for it. And then another thing is, we were talking about like history and biases, but also something that I was thinking of is that a lot of the time it's either trying to cover it or water down what has happened in history, whereas history is history. And like, yeah, for certain year levels, we probably need to be sensitive about what we're sharing, but it doesn't matter how horrible it is. We need to learn about every aspect of something.
That's so important. And in the World War II and Hitler, we see that Hitler had dreams for his nation. He built motor cars called the Volkswagen, the people's car, and yet things went astray. And that raises questions how, if you don't have sufficient accountability alongside you, and you raise a very good point, human people have similar viewpoints of right and wrong, and the value of human life, and yet World War II shows that that can disappear in the middle of a war, and dreadful things can happen. So great points. Tegan, what stood out to you today?
I would I would say that we mentioned a leader can be good or bad. Histories can be personal. I think it was good seeing everyone's perspectives today, and also that us doing this history stuff, like I've just realized I have to look more into the stuff because I don't know anything about history because I'm not a fan of it, but I have to really look into different things. So yeah.
Sounds good. Now I'm told that there's only one date you have to remember, and it's 1066. Now, I don't know what happens then, but who can tell me what happens in 1066? Elka, what happened in 1066?
My nimble fingers say the Battle of Hastings, but I don't know why.
Yes, that's right. So 1066, Battle of Hastings. And at the Battle of Hastings, the Norman French army from over in France came over and marched into England, and there's a lot of French words came into the English language, and so a big event there.
Maybe that's the only date you need to know if you're studying languages. So,
right. Yes. Yes, but there could be other dates. You think World War I, World War II, we've decided.
Yeah, it's also a little bit Eurocentric.
Yes.
It involves 2 European countries, and that is history.
And if you try and tell our Aboriginal First Nations people that 1066 is the only date they need to know, they will scratch their heads perhaps a bit as well. Jackson, what stood out to you today?
Yeah, so my first one was like just seeing everyone's different perspectives, how our perspectives are different perspectives are shown throughout history. You know, we get the example of Germany and Hitler, and then you also see like that point of view, but then also how our own historical circumstances shape our biasness as well.
Yeah, so good. Now let's finish by, and then if you've got any questions after that, I want to read a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. In a sermon that he delivered in New York at the Cathedral of St. John, The Death of Evil on the Sea Shore, in which he talked about the major lessons of history. He said, there's hardly anything more obvious in our study of history than the fact that evil is present in the universe. We may debate the origin of evil and Adam and Eve, etc., but only the person victimized with superficial optimism will debate the reality. We've got to admit evil is there. So in a sense, the whole of history is a history of the struggle between good and evil, and it's often in the core of each human person. This is a tension at the very core of the universe and at the core of the heart of each human person. Evil is ultimately doomed, however, says Martin Luther King, by the powerful insurgent force of good and God. Good Friday may occupy the throne for a day, but ultimately it must give way to the triumphant beat of the drums of Easter Sunday and the resurrection. Evil may so shape events that Caesar will occupy a palace and Christ a cross, but one day the same Christ will rise up and split history into AD and BC, so that even the name of Caesar will be dated by Jesus' name, AD. The death of Egyptians upon the seashore when Moses leads the people out and the Egyptians chase them to make them slaves again, but they're left dead by the waters rushing in, is a glaring symbol of the ultimate doom of evil in its struggle with good. There's something in the very nature of the universe which is on the side of Israel, on the side of good. There is something in the very nature of the universe which ultimately comes to the aid of goodness in the perennial struggle with evil. As James Russell Lowell said, truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne, but the scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown stands God in the shadow, keeping watch over his own. We're seeing now this struggle in the gradual victory of forces of freedom and justice. And the Red Sea has opened up because God has a great plan for this world, and his purpose is to achieve a world where all men will live together as brothers, where every man recognises the dignity and worth of all humanity. So I think that's a good concluding point as we look at history and the struggle between good and evil, the biases in the way we see it, the way we teach it. But certainly we'll be communicating history in our classrooms, our own personal histories, and we'll also be communicating the histories of the worlds around us. We need to be authentic and true. We need to be sensitive to bias, but if we communicate it well, then that will be helpful and effective. Do we have any questions at all about course or assignments or that which we're studying?
I don't have any questions, but I do have something that I need to discuss with you after the lecture.
All right, so we'll stop in a moment and have a discuss. Let me close with a prayer now. Heavenly Father, we thank you for opportunity to share together. We thank you for that which we're learning. We thank you for the future hopes and promises that we have in our studies and work. We thank you that you're with us, and we pray that you'd give us courage, you'd give us skills, you'd help us along the way and help us to become more like you desire us to be and more like Jesus. Amen. So thank you each one, and I'll chat to Gary. Thank you.
Hey, Sam.
Yes.
I'm just wanted to apprise you of my situation. I'm going to get married next Thursday. So I won't be here for a few weeks.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to try get all the, I guess the posts done before I leave, but I will be taking my laptop in case I need to get some things out. So I'm trying to be ahead of work instead of ending up being behind.
Yep.
Is that all good?
Yeah, no, that sounds fine. We also have a class next Tuesday if you want to attend. So that's instead of the Wednesday afternoon class, there's a Tuesday afternoon for 2 hours if you want to attend that one.
What time does that start?
And that will be 3 till 5 by Zoom.
Okay.
So it's the same link. So if you want to,
That might be, I might be late to it, but I might be able to do it.
Yeah, sounds fine. And then there'll be a recording from the class next week you'll be able to watch, and that'll be there for weeks following.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that should be fine. And then I think you've still got a few weeks before the assignment is due. So
pretty sure I have it.
Yeah, looking, there's some material not up for the weeks to come, but yeah, if you're happy with, I'm happy to work with any of those. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah,
Sounds
I just wanted you to be aware in case you guys keep note of who's in there or not, and so.
Yeah, that sounds good. And we do keep a bit of a note of how things are going. So keep us informed, and wish you well for next week.
Thank you very much. See ya.
Thanks, then. Bye.